Alright, what is happening? How's everybody doing today? My name is Chuck and welcome back to a brand new video. So listen guys, today I wanted to go through and give you guys a bit of a different top 5 than what I normally do. Normally it's all about the overpowered guns, and I walk you guys through a lot of my classes, which has basically a ton of different meta type builds and some stuff that I like to experiment with, but I want to go through today and do something a little bit different. Today I'm going to give you guys a top 5 best for the off meta weapons, or the guns that don't get used as much but are still really good. But like always, before we get any farther into the video, make sure you guys go ahead and drop a like in the next 5 seconds for some good luck, and also subscribe with all notifications turned on. We're on the road to 800,000 subscribers, so it'd be awesome if you could join the squad. And I would like to mention that Gamer Advantage is indeed a partner of the channel. They provide me with these amazing glasses that protect my eyes while I'm gaming for long hours at a time. This prevents a lot of eye strain, headaches, helps me sleep better at night. So if you guys would like to do that, you spend a lot of time playing video games, make sure you guys go head over to gameradvantage.com using the link in the description below and just throw in code Chuck to save yourself some money at checkout. If you do that, it supports me and the channel, and I genuinely appreciate that. Okay, so our first gun here today is going to be with the MP7, because the MP7 is an amazing gun, but it just doesn't get used as much because the time to kill on it is not nearly as good as some of the other different guns, but it's still incredibly good to use overall. So the first thing we're doing here is we're going to throw on that monolithic suppressor for that sound suppression, that damage range. I think you guys should always be running the mono on all the modern warfare weapons. There's no real reason you should be running anything else different. It just doesn't make sense. Next up in the barrel section, what we're going to be using is the FSS Recon barrel for that maximum damage range, bullet velocity, and of course that recoil control. This gun's going to be more or less a laser beam anyway, so I just want to be able to accentuate, you know, what the traits and characteristics that it has to the absolute maximum. So we're trying to make this thing super effective at that close to medium range, and this barrel is definitely going to do that for you guys. Next up in the underbarrel section, this is where you can kind of switch things up here a little bit from even what I got. So you can run basically one of two things. You can run the commando foregrip for that, you know, that recoil stabilization. It's not going to help you out as much though in that hipfire category as something like, let's say, the Merc foregrip. So if you feel like you want to be able to have more recoil control slash hipfire accuracy, you know, as opposed to the commando, which is just going to help you out with a little bit of that vertical slash horizontal recoil and just kind of stabilizing you a bit, I'd go with the Merc foregrip if you just really like that hipfire. But for me, I like going with the commando just because I feel like it's just going to slow down my ADS time a little bit too much to use the Merc. So basically those are your two options, and you'd be pretty much fine with any of them, or either of them I should definitely say. Next up, we are in the laser section here, and what we're going to be putting on this gun is going to be the 5MW laser. What this is going to help us do is increase our hipfire accuracy and our sprint to fire speed. So that's why I say, like, I can use the commando foregrip, and then I'll use this as opposed to maybe using the Merc foregrip and maybe throwing on a different attachment. I just really like using a laser on a lot of my Modern Warfare SMGs. I think it's super good, super beneficial. So I definitely go ahead and recommend for you guys to go and try this one out. And then last but definitely not least, our ammunition. We're going to go ahead and slap on the 60 round magazine. This definitely does come down to personal preference though. I'm a 60 round magazine kind of guy, so I'm just going to go and throw that on there. If you guys want to, you can definitely go ahead and throw on the 50 round magazine and you'll be entirely fine that way. This is my full MP7 build. Definitely a banger of a build. Definitely go try it out. Super effective still, but it's just kind of a little bit off meta. Okay, so next up what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump into this beautiful weapon here, the M13, and another amazing gun from Modern Warfare that just doesn't get enough love. I think largely because it doesn't have the fastest time to kill in the world, but it's so unbelievably accurate and has a crazy fast fire rate that I really like it. So first attachment here, as always, the mono suppressor. I'm not going to explain that one too much since everybody kind of knows you should be running this on all of your guns anyways. I explain that for the MP7. Next up though, in the barrel section, we're going to be maximizing the benefits of this gun because I do believe it is necessary to run this, which is the Tempest Marksman barrel for the damage range, bullet velocity, and of course that recoil control. I love this barrel. This is going to be exclusively the one I run on my M13. I've tried to make it into an SMG or try to do some other stuff like that. It realistically only works in multiplayer for Modern Warfare, not necessarily in Warzone or even on Rebirth. I would just stick to making this a super long range AR, just giving it the most amount of range and that stuff possible. And also, of course, you can control that recoil, which it doesn't have a ton to begin with, but it definitely still has some. Next up, in the underbarrel section, we are going to use the commando foregrip. I have used at certain points in time the Merc foregrip. I just do think that realistically it slows down my aim down sight speed a little bit too much, so I definitely recommend for you guys to just stick with the commando. And if you feel like you really need something else, maybe throw on something like maybe the Ranger if you're just trying to control that recoil. It won't slow you down as much as the Merc, but definitely go in and just stick to the commando. I think that's perfectly fine as is. Next up in the ammunition, we're going to be running the 60 round magazine. Of course, like I said, I'm a 60 round magazine kind of guy, so that's just kind of what I run. I would definitely stay away from these blackout rounds. These things are absolute trash. Don't ever use them. Even in like public match multiplayer, I still wouldn't even suggest using them. I would still recommend to go for the 60 round magazine over the 50 though, just because the fire rate is incredibly high. So definitely go ahead and run that. And then to finish out this M13 build here, we're running the VLK 3x optic. you can definitely run this, or there is a solid option in the Corp Combat Hollow sight. I think either or is going to be amazing. Sometimes I'll run the Corp Combat if I'm playing Rebirth or something like that, just because, you know, this gun still has a pretty good time to kill, so I'll maybe kind of whip it out sometimes even in those closer quarter situations. But if you're playing regular for Dansk, I would just recommend running the VLK 3x optic. This is going to be perfect for it. This is a banger setup for a gun that just doesn't get enough love, but every time I make a video on it, people seem to really like it, so definitely go ahead and try this one out. Next up on our list here is going to be the Fennec. This has an incredibly fast time to kill, but some of the mobility just makes it not as meta, just because it's not as usable as some of the other stuff that has greater mobility. So let's jump into this build here. We have our muzzle that is indeed blocked off because our barrel section actually is the ZLR18 deadfall barrel, which has a integrated monolithic suppressor, which is awesome. So it's kind of like the 2-for-1 on our attachments. This gives us that damage range, recoil control, bullet velocity, and of course that sound suppression. This is going to be a true close quarters build. You're not going to want to whip this out at very, like, you know, long ranges at all, even that medium range. This is true close quarters right here, so I definitely recommend you guys only to use it in that sort of range. Next up in the underbarrel section, I do believe the Merc foregrip is definitely necessary for this gun. You normally use the Commando foregrip on a lot of different stuff, but I mean, for me, whenever I say I'm using the Fennec, I always want to be able to throw on the Merc foregrip for this thing, especially in Warzone, just because it has a super fast time to kill. It's got a, you know, really high fire rate, so you want to be able to make sure you're hitting as many of those shots in that close quarter situation as possible, because it also doesn't have the biggest magazine size, which of course we'll go over here in just a second because that's our next attachment, and that is indeed going to be the 40 round drum mag, and this is basically as high as you possibly can get with this thing. Normally speaking, I like to have it maybe be around 50 or like 55, especially because this thing has such a high fire rate, but we have to kind of work with what we got here, and that's just why this thing is a little bit not as meta, because, you know, it's the mobility, the magazine size, still really good, but, you know, it's just, you know, a few different things here holding it back. And next up, we're going to be using actually the sleight of hand perk on this thing. I don't normally run perks in Warzone or even in multiplayer, but I would say that this gun is kind of deserving of that, just because the reload speed on this thing, for whatever reason, that's another kind of drawback to it, is a little bit abysmal. Like, it just sucks for like no reason. I don't really get it. So I definitely say sleight of hand is incredibly good, and especially because we have to compete with a lot of those Cold War guns now in terms of, like, you know, how fast they can reload at close range. I would definitely say sleight of hand is definitely kind of a, you know, necessary evil, at least in this thing here. And then the last, definitely not least, we're going to be running the no stock attachment to give us the most amount of movement speed and aim down sight speed bonus, or pro, we possibly can get, because we're trying to, of course, increase our mobility a little bit, as we have, technically speaking, decreased it with that the Merc foregrip there. But we've definitely evened this thing out and made it absolutely amazing for close range, and you guys should definitely go ahead and give this a shot. Definitely a really, really solid gun to use, but just has a couple of different drawbacks. For our fourth gun here on this, we're going to be using the Uzi, and this is a gun that doesn't get used primarily because it's magazine size, but it's a really, really good gun if you do happen to actually enjoy the iron sights on it. So now let's jump into this. Of course, first thing is the monolithic suppressor. I believe that is indeed the best, of course, like I've said previously here, so we're not going to waste time on that. Next up, what we're going to be using is basically, this is the DLC barrel that got added a little while back, or I should say a long while back, the FSS Carbine Pro. This is basically the best barrel you can possibly run on this thing. Damage range, bullet velocity, recoil control. This is like the trifecta of stuff we can get out of a barrel, and I do believe this is indeed the best one. I mean, there's some other stuff in here that could be, I guess you could classify as better if you want to run the factory carbine, but the Carbine Pro, I mean, listen, we're just going to use this as there's so many more benefits here, and I would definitely suggest to use that, you know, especially because we're trying to make the Uzi as effective as possible, because it does have, of course, a little bit of downsides, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Next up, though, we're in the underbarrel section. We're running the Merc foregrip for that recoil control and hipfire accuracy. The Uzi does tend to have a bit of some interesting recoil on it, I will not lie, and that's probably one of the reasons I'm not a personal user of the Uzi in Warzone, apart from that magazine size. And so I just say that you guys should run the Merc foregrip on here. Of course, this is a close quarters gun, so we're trying to hit as many shots as possible. So definitely go ahead and run the Merc foregrip on this. Next up, this is what I was talking about right here. And the reason it has a bad magazine size is because in order to get the most amount of damage out of this gun possible, you have to run the .41 AE 32 round magazine. you can run the regular ammunition on this, that 40 and 50, but I will say that it's kind of going to feel a little bit like a pea shooter, and so that's why you should definitely run this, and this will make a world of difference in your gunfights. Though, of course, the drawback is that it only has 32 rounds in a magazine, which, normally speaking, every other SMG that we're to be using has pretty much about 40 to 60 rounds at minimum. So this is kind of like the drawback and why it's not as meta. If that 41 AE round magazine had maybe like a 40 and a 45 round mag, then this probably could be a little bit more meta for sure. It definitely could be like a top tier SMG, but that's just kind of not the case. Last but not least on this thing, we're running the stipple grip tape here for that aim down sight speed, sprint to fire speed. This is an amazing attachment to use. I'd highly recommend running the stipple grip tape on your gun. This helps you out, makes this thing a little bit more mobile, a little bit more agile, and overall a really solid attachment on basically any gun. The Uzi is definitely a little bit slept on, pretty good, but of course, like I said, just a little bit off meta because it has a little bit of drawbacks to it. And last but not least, what we're going to be doing here is checking out the Oden. So this is a gun from way back that a lot of people really seem to like because it hit pretty hard, but of course, like I said, it's just not as meta right now because there's a few different things that take the place of it. So the first thing here is we're actually going to be using the Colossus suppressor, and it's got a pretty accurate name because this suppressor is dang huge. I mean, this is probably the largest suppressor in the entirety of Warzone, Modern Warfare, Cold War. Like, this is the largest one out there. This is going to give them the maximum sound suppression, damage range, and recoil control, which is definitely what we want. Because the Oden can have a little bit of some interesting recoil, so we want to be able to control that as much as possible. Next up in the barrel section, running the largest barrel we can get, which is the Oden Factory 810mm barrel for that maximum damage range, below velocity, of course, that recoil control, the trifecta, of which is stuff I always talk about. So I definitely recommend to run this. This is definitely by far the best one you can possibly run for the Oden. Next up in the underbarrel section, what we're going to be doing is run the Commando foregrip. If you really want to, you can run something like maybe the Merc or the Ranger, but I would definitely suggest to kind of stick to the Commando just because while it still may have a little bit of some interesting recoil, it's definitely not any bit beneficial for you guys to go ahead and slow this gun down even more because this is not a very high mobility gun to begin with. So we're not trying to slow ourselves down like, to be super like slow as molasses here. So the Commando is definitely going to be good for you guys. And then also in the ammunition, so this is kind of why it's not as meta right here, is that for this right here, is that it only has a 30 round magazine maximum. It starts out with about 20 rounds default, and that's just because it's one of those guns that hits really, really hard, but it also just doesn't have a very high magazine count. If it maybe had a 40 to a 45, or maybe even a 50 round magazine, I could definitely see this gun, kind of shining a little bit just because, it hits really, really hard, but it's just not that gun. And I would suggest probably to use this thing maybe in solos or maybe even duos. But at that point, sometimes, 30 rounds, you could waste 30 on a single person very, very easily, especially if you miss a couple shots, their distance. I mean, it's pretty easy to blow through 30 rounds. I mean, I sometimes find myself going through 45 to 60 rounds on maybe 1 to 2 people just because you get into some gunfights that you just really need to kind of spray and pray. So that's kind of why we're running the 30. This is the maximum you can get. And last but not least, on the rear grip, what we're going to be using is the stipple grip tape, of course, for that aim down sight speed and sprint to fire speed. This is, like I said, a slow gun, so we're trying to speed ourselves up here a little bit, this is what this is going to do. Awesome attachment. Love running the stipple and everything, and that's definitely going to be the last gun here in our off meta top 5 because Oden's really good. It's just definitely not meta. If you guys enjoyed this video, want to see more, give it a like, subscribe if you are brand new, turn on those post notifications, and just remember, don't triple cap, don't be Randy, and I'm out. Peace.